Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about something very interesting, a question that a lot of people have probably asked to themselves, and that question is, who wrote the Bible? How do we have the Bible as we know it today? So, we're going to cover the canonical verses. We're not going to go over a lot of tradition, like a lot of traditions and a lot of ideas and concepts of the sort. We're going to be kind of sticking to the verse, sticking to what the biblical verses say about, who wrote them, right? However, we are going to cover some tradition, some theory, and speculation on how we got the Bible today. So let's begin with the hardest part, which is deciphering how we even have the start of the Bible anyway. How do we have everything from Genesis chapters 1 through 11? Because I can understand chapters 12 and onward because it's the history of Israel. Of course, the people of Israel would have a written record of their history. But how do we have stuff like the story of the flood and Cain and Abel and the origin of the earth? How do we have that stuff in the Bible? Well, the Bible actually gives us some hints throughout. So, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, God clearly states to Moses that, quote, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." And we know that this is God speaking because at the very start of the chapter it says, quote, "And God spoke all these words," end quote. So God is literally telling Moses, hey, I did this all in 6 days, and on the seventh day I rested. He doesn't give the details at all. Like, he does not specify the details at all other than I made the heaven, the earth, and everything in them in 6 days, and then I rested on the seventh. So how do we have the exact details of the creation? Probably thanks to something that we'll bring up here in a second, which is basically mouth to mouth spreading of the story, because these are stories that would originally you'd sit around the campfire and read them, and you'd pass the story from generation to generation. So here we see that Moses, after literally hearing, we have two instances here, or we have several instances actually throughout the entire first 5 books of Moses writing down the law of God. Everything that God tells him for the law, and he writes it down in the book of the law. So we read here in Exodus chapter 24, verse 4, Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said after God literally just basically talks to him on a mountain for a whole day. Moses just writes it all. Well, not a whole day, but you get the idea. And we have another instance in chapter 34, verse 27, that says, quote, that it's God specifically talking to Moses, that says, quote, "Write down these words, for in accordance with these words, I have made a covenant with you and Israel." So this is after God's done talking with Moses. Like, God's already said everything that he needs to say to Moses. He's got everything he needed to say out of the way. So clearly we see that the law was written down by Moses under the instruction of God. Because, of course, there's no way a population of 2 million people are just going to tell the law, are going to remember the law, first of all, because clearly they fail at doing that anyway, even with the book. So just imagine how they would have gone simply by remembering what the law said. So, God kind of needed that to happen. So we read in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 9, that, quote, "Moses wrote down this law and gave it to the Levitical priests, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel." So Moses had written down the law of Moses, and had well, Moses had written down the law of Moses. Wow, shocker mark. But Moses wrote down the law that God had given to him, and he made copies of it, seemingly, giving it to the priests for the Ark of the Covenant, but also to the elders. And the elders would kind of be sort of like judges for the people, and they'd use the law as reference for that. And later down in the same chapter, in verse 24, it says, once again, after Moses finished writing so Moses finished writing in a book all the words of this law from beginning to end. Now, this law is specific because it's not the law, like the law that God gave to Moses on the mountain. That's already written down in the book of the law. This is a different law. This is what Moses was talking about in the entirety of Deuteronomy. Because if we read from the start of Deuteronomy to the very end, we see that it's literally just Moses giving a history lesson to the new generation of the people of Israel. It's Moses going out of his way to teach the new generation of Israelites about their history, and that goes over everything. That goes over absolutely everything that came from Mount Sinai up to that very point. So basically, the entirety of the books of Numbers, Leviticus, and of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers was just told by Moses on the mountain. If we read here, if we read here in chapter 1 of Deuteronomy, these are the words Moses spoke to all Israel in the wilderness east of the Jordan. And he said, and in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses proclaimed to the Israelites all that the Lord had commanded him concerning them. And he just explained. And it says here, east of the Jordan in the territory of Moab, Moses began to expound this law. So seemingly, alongside the laws that God had given him, Moses had added an extra expansion that was the history of Israel up to that point. So that answers how we get some of the information, but there's some stories here that are clearly left out. Like, what about like the details of the creation of the world? What about Adam and Eve, the fall, Cain and Abel, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph? What about them? How do the people of Israel and how do we now know all of this if at the earliest point possible there wasn't even like a written testimony of this? Well, writing down things isn't the only ways you can pass down tradition. And that goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the mouth-to-mouth stuff. Not that mouth-to-mouth as in talking to another person. So we read in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 7 to 8, remember the days of old, consider the generations long past. Ask your father, and he will tell you, your elders, and they will explain to you, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all of mankind, he set up boundaries for the people according to the number of the sons of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. I'm going to read off a bit into the next verses. In the desert land he found him, in a barren and howling waste. He shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his eye, like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carries them aloft. The Lord alone led him. No foreign god was with him. So here Moses clearly states that elders would pass down traditions. The stories from Genesis 1 up to Genesis 50 were all stories that the elders would sit around the camp, it'd be like the elders would sit in their tents near the campfires and they'd tell the stories to the kids, and then then those kids will grow up and they'll do the same. And that's been happening for generations, seemingly from the time of Abraham to now. It seems that all of this stuff has been passing on. Now, how did they learn about all this is unclear. It likely started through Noah. I mean, Methuselah was alive during the days of Noah, so Methuselah could have told, because the people, the generations that came after Adam up to Noah, they lived years So these stories were not uncommon. However, as time went on, people began to get more wicked, and only Noah would have been the only one who would have known. So I just presumed that the stories of the garden and of the creation story would have been passed down from Adam to Seth, from Seth to Enosh, all the way down to Noah. Noah would pass that down to Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Unfortunately, Shem and Japheth would, like the families of Shem and Japheth would divide away. They'd make their own creation stories, as we see with Nimrod, and they'd make themselves gods, as we see with the pharaohs and the kings of the other nations that come from Ham and Japheth. However, Shem and his family seem to have stayed dedicated to the Lord up till like around Terah's life, since Terah likely sold idols, considering the place he came from. But Abraham clearly had some level of knowing of God in some traditions and other stories. So it seems that that these traditions, these stories of what we know now as the Jewish Bible, have been passed down from Adam all the way down to now. And now there was a written account of all that stuff. So there was no need for more passing down of the torch. It was all saved in the book. So now Israel has history no longer told from one mouth to another. Instead, it is now all written in a book. Now, clearly now we have some sort of explanation for everything that we see from Genesis up to Deuteronomy. What about the next portion, Joshua and the conquest? Well, we start off seeing that Joshua clearly was a very studious person. He was very studious in the law of Moses, and he was kind of like he was kind of Moses's right hand man, being by his side and being kind of the general of the army. And he is trusted enough to the point where Moses, where both God and Moses trust Joshua with being able to be the one who leads Israel. So he's very faithful, and it is shown immediately at the start of the book that Joshua studies the law. So we see in chapter 1 of Joshua, verse 8. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. And clearly Joshua sticks to this for the rest of his life, because we see in Joshua chapter 8, verse 34 that, quote, afterward, Joshua read all the words of the law, the blessing and its cursings, just as it is written in the book of the law. So he's reading everything from Exodus to Deuteronomy. And we see that this lasts up to his last moments, where Joshua literally retells the story of Israel's history to the people in his final moments of life. We can find this in Joshua chapter 24, verses 2 to 26. Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the Euphrates and led him throughout Canaan and gave him many descendants. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I assigned the hill country of Seir to Esau, but Jacob and his family went down to Egypt. Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I afflicted the Egyptians by what I did there, and brought you out. When I brought your people out of Egypt, you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued them with chariots and horsemen as far as the Red Sea. But they cried to the Lord for help, and he put darkness between you and the Egyptians. He brought the sea over them and covered them. You saw with your own eyes what I did to the Egyptians. Then you lived in the wilderness for a long time. I brought you to the land of the Amorites who lived east of the Jordan. They fought against you, but I gave them into your hands. I destroyed them from before you, and you took possession of their land. When Balak, son of Zippor, the king of Moab, prepared to fight against Israel, he sent Balaam, son of Beor, to put a curse on you. But I would not listen to Balaam, so he blessed you again and again, and I delivered you out of his hand. Then you crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. The citizens of Jericho fought against you, as did also the Amorites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Girgashites, Hivites, and Jebusites. But I gave them into your hands. I sent the hornet ahead of you, which you drove them out before you. Also the 2 Amorite kings, you did not do it with your own sword and bow. So I gave you a land on which you did not toil, and cities you did not build. And you live in them, and eat from vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. Now fear the Lord, and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. This is Joshua talking. He's saying basically, me and my family, we're serving the Lord. As I said earlier, he is very dedicated to those words Moses and God had told them at the start of his job as leader of Israel. Then the people answered, Far be it from us to forsake the Lord to serve other gods. It was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our parents up out of Egypt from that land of slavery and performed those great signs before our eyes. He protected us on our entire journey and among all the nations through which we traveled. And the Lord drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites who lived in this land. We too will serve the Lord because he is our God. Joshua said to the people, You are not able to serve the Lord. He is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your rebellion and your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after he has been good to you. But the people said to Joshua, No, we will serve the Lord. Then Joshua said, You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen to serve the Lord. Yes, we are witnesses, they replied. Now then, said Joshua, throw away the foreign gods that are among you and yield your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, We will serve the Lord, our God, and obey him. So Joshua retells the entire history of the Israelites from the very start to where they were at that moment. And don't worry, Joshua, old habits die hard. Joshua does the exact same thing that Moses does and writes the history of the Israelites in the book of the law, now including what happened before Moses and what happened after. On that, and this is where we continue on verses 25 through 26. On that day, Joshua made a covenant for the people, and there at Shechem he reaffirmed for them decrees and laws. And Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. Then he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak near the holy place of the Lord. So all of the stuff so everything that happens from the creation up to Joshua has been written down. Now, from here on out, it's going to get a bit harder to find verses that talk about writing, everything that we see in the Bible. I mean, we don't even get we don't even know who the writers behind Judges and Ruth are. So those are whole 2 books that we cannot account for. However, there's an interesting detail that can be found in 1 Chronicles chapter 29 verses 26 through 30, which I have built a theory upon. David, son of Jesse, was king over all Israel. He ruled over Israel 40 years, 7 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. He died at a good old age, having enjoyed long life, wealth, and honor. His son Solomon succeeded him as king. As for the events of King David's reign, from beginning to end, they are written in the records of Samuel the seer, the records of Nathan the prophet, and the records of Gad the seer, together with the details of his reign and power and the circumstances that surrounded him and Israel and the kingdoms of all the other lands. Now, I was reading this, and I thought to myself, records? Written records. These important characters in Jewish history, Samuel, Nathan, and Gad, all of these were messengers of God, people who were anointed by God to do specific things. And we see that David is among these. Now, his records are kept alongside with these. And it seems that Samuel wrote records of David, Nathan did too, and so did Gad. So these records are all, so David's story is kept within these records. Everything that we read in 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and in the Chronicles are all things that were written down in the records of these three people. And we see that important events surrounding David and Israel, and all of the other and the kingdoms of all the other lands, they're also kept here. So one note immediately here: important people and important events are kept in records of the people of Israel, scrolls which would later be compiled into the Jewish Bible. So here we see that the records, so basically the book of the law, which at this point contains the summaries of Moses and Joshua about the history alongside with the law that God gave on Mount Sinai, they're all kept in the book of the law. So the book of the law makes up everything from Genesis through Joshua. These records, specifically the records of Samuel, likely make up Judges, Samuel, and some later ones may make Kings. So basically, we have the heart of the Jewish Bible being created right here. And my theory is that these records have existed for a while. Important characters and events, all of these things are written down for people, all of these things are written down for the Jewish people to remember, and we see that this thing is not an unordinary occurrence in the world of the Jews at this time, the world of the Old Testament. We see here in Ezra chapter 6, verse 1, that it says this, quote, "That night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him." So we see that even other kings had kept records, had kept records of all of the important events that had taken place. And there's even everyone from the Egyptians to the Mesopotamians did this. There's even fun fact. There's even Merneptah Stela that exists. A stela is basically like a chronicle of victories that belong to the pharaoh Merneptah, which actually gives reference to a people called Israel, which is funny and ironic because this stela was meant to talk about the end of Israel, when instead, like the destruction, the end of Israel, we're wiping them out, they will no longer be remembered, and now that is used now to prove the existence of the ancient Israelites. So that's a little fun something. So I think one way that everything from Joshua up to Malachi can be explained, like how can all of these things be kept, is that the chronicles that are found in Kings and Chronicles, ironically, and everything from the minor and from the minor and the greater prophets, all of that stuff is kept in books, in records, in chronicles. So the records of all these kings and the great things they've done, that's what the books of Kings and Chronicles are. They are writings created. They are writings created by scribes and prophets. It's of the Israelite people. They're keeping records of their history, and that includes the history of their kings and also their downfall. But the kings weren't the only one who kept records of the things that they did. The prophets also kept records. Now, there's an interesting detail that can be found in the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 2, it says this, quote, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood from the scriptures, according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet, that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. Wait. Is this a prophet making a reference to another prophet? This is another moment when I was like, hey, that's kind of suspicious. That's kind of weird. So I realized that there were many references sort of like this, of prophets referencing other prophets. I mean, In the book of Malachi, there's references to Elijah. In the book of Ezekiel, there's references to Daniel. In the book of Daniel, there's references to Jeremiah. And the book of Joel is just a reference to basically every single prophet in the Bible. And this is making me realize that these prophets also kept records of their prophecies. So they would write down their prophecies in books, and it's actually very clearly stated in several books that these are the words which the Lord spoke to insert prophet, who lived during insert time in insert place during the reign of insert kings. So and we have direct evidence of this in Jeremiah chapter 36, verse 4, which reads, "So Jeremiah called Baruch, son of Neriah, and while Jeremiah dictated all the words that the Lord had spoken to him, Baruch wrote them on the scroll." So Baruch wrote down every single prophecy that Jeremiah gave in a scroll. And when this scroll gets burned, Baruch writes it again. So each and every prophet probably had a situation similar to this, where they had a scribe and they would write, or they themselves would write down the words God had spoken to them in books. And all of these books would be compiled in the future to be used as basically history, basically as a history of the people. And we see in the New Testament that this is a thing that certainly did exist at that time, because they had synagogues, and in those synagogues they would specifically talk about the prophets in their history. And clearly by the point of the New Testament, everybody knows of every Old Testament story from Abraham up to Malachi. So by the time of the New Testament, when Jesus is born, there are already written records of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. And we see in Nehemiah chapter 1, we read that in the first verse, we read, hold on, let me get it if it loads. We read this in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. And we read this: "In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, And in verse 3, they said to me, in verse 4, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fastened and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said," Nehemiah is the writer here. He's very clearly the writer. He talks in the first person, and the start of the book literally says, oh yeah, these are the words that I said. So here we see that even after the exile, we have these things that are written in records, and eventually all of these things are compiled by several scribes and priests and prophets to create the Jewish Bible. So to summarize what we have so far for the Old Testament, but before Moses' time, all of these things were traditions, stories that would be told from generation to generation. Then, by Moses and Joshua's time, these things were all written down in the book of the law. So the history of the Jews, alongside with the law that God had dictated to them, had all been written in the book of the law. Then, from the time of Judges up to the time of Nehemiah, records would be kept and written, chronicles, records of important people and important events. All of those things would be written down in records, and eventually a group of priests and scribes would compile all these things to become the Jewish Old Testament. And by the time of Jesus himself, all of these things would be compiled into a singular book, the Jewish Bible. And Jesus himself makes reference to the Jewish Bible. Luke chapter 24, verse 24. Luke chapter 24, verse 44. He being Jesus, said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the Torah, the prophets, the Nevi'im, and the Psalms, aka the writings, aka the Ketuvim. So Jesus himself makes a perfect reference that knocks out every single book in the Old Testament to be written by his time. All of the Old Testament is proof to have already been written. So we already know how basically the entire Old Testament is written by the time of Jesus. Wait, I feel like I'm forgetting something important. Oh, right. The writings. The writings are a bit complicated. The writings are kind of iffy on when they were written and who they were written by. However, there is evidence of who wrote them and how they ended up in the Hebrew Bible. So, in the book of Ezekiel, there is a verse in chapter 14, verse 14, alongside 14, verse 20, that mentions three important biblical characters, Noah, Daniel, and Job. Quote, even if Noah, Daniel, and Job, these three were in it, they would save only their own lives by their righteousness, says the Lord their God. And again, though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, as I live, saith the Lord, they shall neither deliver son nor daughter. They shall but deliver their own souls by their righteousness. So clearly Noah and Job were already known figures. So Daniel obviously would have been a known figure. His records are literally kept, and he talks in the first person. He clearly wrote some of the he clearly wrote the latter half of his book. The first half probably was chronicles of the king of the reigns of the kings during his time. However, Job and Noah did not write anything. You may be able to excuse Noah off, since, Noah probably had to be mentioned at some point throughout throughout what Moses and Joshua wrote. Since Moses makes it because Moses mentions the creation of the world, so clearly he must, and he also mentions the Tower of Babel, so he must have known. So you'd assume he'd know something about Noah, right? But Job is so mysterious. Like, nobody even knows who wrote Job or when it takes place. The book is so obscure that you could speculate that the book of Job takes place anywhere from the exile of the Jews to the times of Abraham. There's no specific time for when Job could have been written. So, but we clearly have evidence that Job was at least at some point well known for his righteousness. So what I can assume is that this is another one of these stories, these traditional stories that would be passed down from generation to generation. And he kind of was and Job to the Israelites was kind of a mixture between myth, legend, and actual historical character. So kind of like Mulan in a sense, or John Henry in a sense, which these two are kind of a blend of historical figure and legendary myth. And I think, my theory is that Job was kind of like this for the Israelites. The books of Psalms and the Proverbs and those writings were likely sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Esther probably falls in. Esther and Ruth probably fall into that same sort of category of being for the Jews being at that time being sort of at the time of Jesus being sort of a mixture of myth, legend, and historical figure. And these would be traditions passed down from mouth to mouth, and that's how we get them. Now, how do we get the Psalms? Well, the Psalms was a prayer book made compiled. The Psalms were many poems and prayer books created by several different authors. And most of them are created by David, but there are also some made by the sons of Korah, by Moses, Solomon, Asaph. There were several authors, and eventually those same priests/scribes that I mentioned earlier would compile these together into one singular poetic book. However, there is a subsection known as kind of like the Solomon. These are kind of Solomon-centered books. So we got Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, all of which are attributed to Solomon at some point. So we get at the start of Proverbs, verse 1, it literally says, "The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel." So all of these proverbs are attributed towards Solomon. Then we have Song of Solomon. Do I even have to explain? No, but I might as well. The start of Song of Solomon is literally, quote, Solomon's Song of Songs, aka Solomon's best song, like the ultimate song out of every song, and that's attributed to Solomon. Now, Ecclesiastes is where it gets a bit watery with it gets a bit messy when it comes to evidence towards it belonging to Solomon. However, there are some details given by the author that implies that they are Solomon. So it says at the very start, quote, "The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem." So presumably this is Solomon, since Solomon was a son of David and a king in Jerusalem. And clearly, this guy knows a lot. And he's talked about having several women. He's had several women, several riches, which fits Solomon. So all of these are books that have been written by kings or that have been compiled over the years and have been added into the official Jewish Bible. So that's how we explain away basically the entire Old Testament. Now comes the New Testament. The New Testament is pretty easy to solve, that I don't even have to search up references for it. There are several letters that are written that are clearly stated at the start to be either of Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, or of Peter, an apostle of the Lord Christ Jesus, or the letters of John and Revelation written by John to the churches in Asia Minor. The Gospels are where it gets kind of messy, and there's no official evidence to who could have written it. Now, there's speculation to who could have written the Apostle, to who could have written the Gospels and the Book of Acts. Basically, it goes like this, according to tradition. The Gospel, according to Matthew, make the connection. You can make the connection. The Gospel, according to Matthew, was written by Matthew. The Gospel, according to Mark, was written by John Mark. And theory states that since in the Bible it is stated that John Mark worked alongside Simon Peter, that John Mark took after Simon. So Simon Peter basically told John Mark everything about the life of Christ that he knows, and John Mark wrote it down. And then we have Luke, who is attributed with 2 books in the Bible for one reason: the start. The start of both books are eerily similar. An introduction here. Luke. Many have undertaken to draw up. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the the certainty of the things you have been taught. So here we get an introduction from the author of this book, Luke. And Luke basically writes down, hey, I've been taking eyewitness accounts, and I've compiled them together to make this. And that's what I think is the key to solving the Gospels. The Gospels are made up of eyewitness accounts. John and Matthew are eyewitness accounts of what they themselves saw, since both of them were disciples. John Mark's Gospel was made as an eyewitness account of Peter, written by Mark. And we get Luke being a compilation of eyewitness accounts from several disciples, several people who were there and saw the miracles, maybe even Mother Mary, probably even Mother Mary, or probably even Mother Mary or Elizabeth, and all these eyewitness accounts come together to create the Gospels. But how does the book of Acts fit into any of this? Well, if we read the introduction in the book of Acts in chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, in my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles. And that's it. That's the whole introduction. He goes into a narrative and leaves it, and it goes like that. So we have an answer to how every single book in the Bible was written. So let's go over everything, sum it up in a short version. Let's sum up everything that we've learned. The original narratives from Genesis 1 through 11 were passed down by elders, starting with Adam, leading up all the way to Moses' time when he writes everything. That's where we hop into Genesis 12 all the way up to Joshua 24. Moses is given the law by God himself, and he writes it down in the book of the law. But then hold on, give me a quick second to deny this call. No. All right, so Moses is given the law, and in Moses' final moments, he retells the entire history of the Jews to the Jewish people, and then he writes it down in said book of the law. Then Joshua does the same. He retells the story of the Jewish people's lives and of the Jewish people's history, and he writes it all down in the book of the law. Then we have several records of prophets and judges, and several chronicles from the reign of many kings, which makes up everything from the book of Judges up to the book of the Chronicles and the story of the exile. There are several poems and prayer books and legends that are fit in, which make up the books of Psalms, Proverbs, the wisdom books, alongside with books that can be found in the writings. So basically, the writings, right? Then we have several accounts from prophets, and we end the Old Testament. Then several eyewitness accounts are compiled to make up the Gospels. Several eyewitness accounts are compiled and brought together, eventually being written as the Gospels. Then several of the original apostles write down several letters to churches across the Roman globe, and at last, John, the visionary, he writes down his vision of the final days and sends them to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. And that's the origin behind how every book in the Bible is now, how we're able to read every single book that is now in the Bible. So, if you found this video, so now you know how the Bible came to be. And I'm currently doing a series, a 7-part series, covering the entire story of the Bible. And I'm currently working on part 5. This can be found. The playlist is up on YouTube under the search name of Radio Liberación Evangélica. And that's all for today. So, my brothers and sisters, may God bless you. May you have a great day. And thank you for being you. Remember, the Lord loves you. There are people out there who love you, but nobody will love you as much as the Lord will. Lord will guide you. Study His Word. Pray every day. Follow His Word. Don't only say, also act. Remember, faith plus actions equals success. Brothers and sisters, remember to trust in the Lord Christ, to not only say, but to also do, and to have a great day. God bless.